We talked about World War II in Europe yesterday, so now we're going to talk about World War II in Asia. So this is between starting right around World War I into the 1970s, because World War II in Asia, there's a lot more involved than just the normal Europe war. So we start with Japanese imperialism. And Japan is the latecomer to the plate. So all the European countries have already kind of divvied up Africa. They've divvied up a lot of the colonies around the world. And then when Japan kind of becomes a bigger member in the Industrial Revolution and becomes more involved, they want to get in on having their own colonies and getting their own raw materials and kind of do the same thing Europe did and the United States did. They just wanted to do it much later. So by the 1930s, Japan had invaded a lot of China, and then started setting their sights on some of the colonies that were held by some of the European powers prior to World War I. So places like Indochina, which now are considered Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, parts of the Philippines. But basically they wanted raw materials. That was the whole reason, because they needed raw materials in order to make finished products, which they could then sell for a higher profit. So the problem at this point with Japan is that they relied mostly on the United States for all of its raw materials. So iron to make, machines and armor and those type of things. Oil, 80% of it came from the United States, and then 50% of copper. And that was kind of a monopoly that Japan wanted to get away from. They wanted to be economically independent so that they could turn their profits into more money and more influence in the region around them. Now, this was a shift away from the attitude that Europe and the United States had after World War I, because they really wanted to stop this growing influence by one particular country. And a lot of it had to do with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and these growing nationalist views that were kind of divvying up Europe at this point. So they looked at Japan as being overly aggressive and overly selfish in wanting to get these types of colonies set up. And it's kind of hypocritical, considering the United States and Europe had done that, 60 years prior. So Japan decided that they were going to go ahead, and they invaded what is now known as northern Vietnam, or the French part of Indochina. And the U.S. had a very strong opinion on Japan's invasion, and basically gave them an ultimatum, said, okay, leave, and leave the parts of China that you've gone in, or, there are going to be punishments. There's going to be problems with that. And Japan said, no, we're not leaving. We invaded, we got here. This is how imperialism happens. And so the United States imposed an embargo on pretty much the raw materials that Japan needed in order to survive. They also froze all the money that Japan had in any United States asset, which really put Japan on the offensive. And a lot of people wonder why Japan decided to attack Pearl Harbor. Because Japan and Germany did not have an agreement at all about going to war with the United States. There wasn't a lot of communication between Japan and Germany. And this was kind of the sealing fate that Japan had to overcome, and it made them pretty angry. The fact that they were out their raw materials and they were out their money that they had invested in some of the United States factories. So Japan was forced to either accept what the U.S. wanted and leave China and Indonesia, which would make them dependent again on the United States for all of the raw materials, or they could go to war and maybe increase the odds of keeping these territories that they had invaded. they were more willing to go to war because they did not want to be dependent. They did not want to seem weak. They wanted what Europe and the United States had achieved at this point. So they decide to attack Pearl Harbor, which was a huge stronghold for the military, for the United States, and it was not, it was kind of an unknown move. So December 7th, 1941, we still kind of honor this day as the day of Pearl Harbor. And Japan pretty much caught us off guard. They were able to disable 19 of our ships and destroy 188 airplanes. And you had a significant amount of military personnel that died that day. 2,400 military personnel died, and then 1,000 of them were wounded, and a lot of which never returned to military service. So this was a huge, huge black day for the military, especially because they had no credible information that this was going to happen. And so these ships were just kind of lined up in the harbor waiting to be attacked. They were an easy target. And the same thing with the airplanes. It was easy to drop one bomb and then, have it ricochet and have it affect more than one ship or one airplane. So FDR, he goes on record, and you can go on to the recordings, that basically he calls Pearl Harbor is a day that will live in infamy. And then December 8th, 1941, we declare war on Japan. And at this point, we are still not involved in World War II with troops on the ground. But Japan was allied with Germany and Italy, but they didn't do it because of Germany. They didn't talk to Germany about it. Now, because Japan and the United States are now at war, Italy and Germany both declare war on the United States. So then you have Great Britain saying, okay, well, we're going to declare war on Japan. So you have these allied agreements still coming into play. They didn't learn from World War I that this is not a good idea. Now, this is not a good topic when it comes to the United States and how we handled things. In response to Pearl Harbor, in response to Japanese aggression, we set up internment camps, which we relocated Japanese Americans because we feared that the Japanese Americans were spies. We thought that Japan had kind of infiltrated us, and so we in turn kept them against their will in these internment camps, which were not good conditions. These are American citizens that America kind of turned on and then put into these camps where, nothing was accomplished. And the property and goods of these, Japanese American citizens, that was confiscated. And this is not a good thing. Most of them were on the West Coast because most of the Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast, and people were housed in there until World War II was over. You have the United States government issuing an apology later on to the Japanese Americans that were forced into these internment camps. They were different. They're not concentration camps. They're not death camps, but they weren't great either. So then you have the Prime Minister of Japan during World War II, who is actually a very intelligent, very thoughtful, very cunning man. And he's a good leader. The problem is he picked a fight with the wrong person. So he's an authoritarian ruler, meaning that kind of what he says goes. And he was very, very popular in Japan. Japan's navy had been built up to rival that of the United States or Great Britain or anybody. Now, when the United States kind of put the full backing of the military behind it in its efforts against Japan, that's when the U.S. started winning these battles. And his popularity in Japan started declining because he started losing. So once Japan surrendered in World War II, he was arrested for war crimes, sentenced to death, and hanged in 1948. So things didn't work out so well for him. U.S. leaders in the Pacific Theater, so you have Douglas MacArthur and then Chester Nimitz, who both led strategic battles and how to kind of overcome the Japanese presence in the Pacific Ocean. So basically you have kind of a lot of battles, one right after the other, between December 1941 and May 1942. This is where Japan really does dominate. They really kind of win and win and win. And then you have MacArthur basically taking troops and positioning them in strategic centers. And he wins. And nobody really thought that he would win at this point. But he was able to get to the Bataan Peninsula and, and kind of gain control of this section of the Philippines. Now, it didn't work out exactly the way he wanted to.